Shaquille O'Neal checked the police, disguised as a homeless man, and what happened next shocked everyone. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments from where you watch this video. The soft hum of the television filled the dimly lit living room, casting fleeting glows across the walls. Shaquille O'Neal sat still in his oversized recliner, his massive hands clasped together, elbows resting on his knees, eyes locked on the screen. His face, usually animated with charisma and humor, was grave. A news anchor spoke with rehearsed solemnity over footage that had become too familiar. A black man, homeless and alone, shoved against a patrol car by two police officers. His face was caked with dirt, his cries drowned under the sound of an officer shouting something unintelligible but unmistakably filled with venom. The man screamed, not from resistance but from pain. Shaq's jaw tightened. The clip ended with a perfunctory disclaimer from the news anchor. The police department has yet to release a full statement. That sentence, those words, he'd heard them 100 times. The remote control lay untouched on the table. He couldn't change the channel. Not anymore. He leaned back, exhaled through his nose, and stared into the flickering screen as if it could answer the question eating at his soul. How many more times? A few seconds later, the soft steps of someone entering the room stirred him. Another one, came the quiet voice of his wife, Letitia, as she carried 2 mugs of chamomile tea. She handed one to him, her eyes following his towards the television. He nodded slowly, not taking his eyes off the screen. Letitia sat beside him, placing her mug on the coffee table. "You've been doing everything you can for years, baby," she said gently. "You've built schools, centers, you've spoken at rallies, funded shelters. And yet, here we are again," he interrupted, his voice low and heavy. He reached for the tea but didn't sip it, just held it for warmth. "The cameras catch it now, but the stories stay the same. The pain's the same. You're not a superhero, Shaq. You've done more than most." He looked down into the steam. Not enough. There was a long pause. The tension between them wasn't conflict. It was sorrow, shared and weary. "I need to know," he muttered finally. Letitia turned toward him, confused. "Know what?" "I need to feel it, see it, be in it. Not on camera, not at press conferences, not as Shaquille O'Neal." He looked up at her, as one of them. She blinked. "You mean?" I need to go out there. Live among the people we see on TV. As someone forgotten. Just another black man on the street. No fame, no armor, just the truth. "You're 6'11", Shaq. You think people won't recognize you?" she said, her tone rising slightly. "You've been famous since college." He gave her a faint smile. "I know, but I've been working with a few makeup artists for my foundation. One of them owes me a favor." He leaned forward. "If I can get out there and no one sees Shaquille O'Neal, then I'll know I'm doing this right." Letitia stood up, pacing. "This is insane. What if something happens to you? What if they hurt you? Or worse?" "Then maybe people will finally listen," he said. "If even I can get treated like dirt, maybe it'll open a few eyes." The conversation stretched late into the night. She argued for caution, for their family, for his safety, but his mind was made up. By morning, he was already on the phone. He called 2 of his most trusted security professionals, both ex-military, both fiercely loyal. He told them everything. The idea, the disguise, the risk. "You want to disappear?" one of them asked. "For a few days," Shaq said. "I'll check in. You'll track me, but I don't want protection. I want reality." They were hesitant. One of them, Marcus, pushed hard against the plan. "You're not just any man, Shaq. If something goes wrong, "Then help me make sure it doesn't," he cut in. "I'm not asking for permission. I'm asking for your support." Reluctantly, they agreed. 5 days later, in a rented motel on the edge of downtown, Shaq stood in front of a full-length mirror. Gone was the clean shave and crisp designer clothes. His face was now lined with age makeup, his beard grizzled, his clothes second-hand and slightly torn. An old army jacket hung off his shoulders, his boots were cracked, and a weathered cap concealed most of his face. He looked unrecognizable, even to himself. For the first time in decades, he didn't see Shaq in the mirror. He stepped out onto the sidewalk, blending into the current of city life. The cold bit through his coat. People brushed past him, avoiding his eyes. No one greeted him. No one smiled. He was invisible. For hours he wandered, past office buildings, bus stops, alleyways. He stopped at a park bench to rest. A woman holding a child glanced at him, clutched her purse, and moved away. By sundown, he made his way to a small encampment under an overpass. The smell of burnt food and exhaust filled the air. He saw clusters of people gathered around trash can fires. Some muttered to themselves, others huddled in silence. He approached slowly, unsure. An older black man with a thick beard and cracked glasses looked up at him. "First time?" the man asked. His voice was hoarse but not unfriendly. Shaq nodded. "Yeah. Name's Walter," the man said, patting the space next to him on a torn sleeping bag. "Stick close. These streets don't play." Shaq sat beside him. "I'm Barry," he said, choosing a name from his old school days. Walter chuckled. "Well, Barry, you picked a hell of a night to be out here." As the night deepened, Walter spoke in half sentences, describing the unwritten rules of survival. Where to go, who to avoid, which shelters were scams, and when to hide. He told stories of cops swinging batons first and asking questions later. He didn't complain. He simply stated facts. "Black, broke, and in the way," Walter said, nodding toward the street where a police cruiser idled in the shadows. "That's how they see us." Shaq listened in silence. Everything he'd suspected was being confirmed. But it hit different here. In the cold. In the dark. Suddenly, 2 teenage boys appeared on the street above. They started jeering, hurling rocks toward the camp. One rock shattered near Shaq's feet. "Hey," Walter yelled, standing with his hands raised. "We ain't looking for trouble." The boys laughed and ran as a distant police siren echoed in the night. But help never came. The police didn't stop, didn't ask if they were okay. Shaq's pulse raced. This was no longer theory, this was lived reality. As he curled up under a dirty blanket beside Walter, with the city rumbling above, he felt the first sting of something that had always been abstract to him. Not anymore. This was only the beginning. The morning came without sunlight. A heavy overcast hung over the city like a damp curtain. The cold still clung to the concrete beneath the overpass where Shaquille, now Barry, stirred awake on a piece of cardboard barely thick enough to insulate him from the hard ground. His back ached and his limbs were stiff, but he didn't move right away. He lay there, his eyes open, listening to the slow rustling of the street life waking up around him, the clatter of a shopping cart, the groan of a bus brake in the distance, the cough of a man further down the encampment. Walter was already up. He crouched near the dying embers of last night's fire, using a bent stick to poke at the ash. "You'll get used to it," he muttered when he noticed Shaquille shifting. "Or you won't. Doesn't matter. It doesn't change." Shaquille sat up, rubbing the soreness out of his neck. The night had felt like a punishment, but it wasn't over. This was just another day for the people who lived here. The two walked together in silence toward a park a few blocks away, where a mobile soup kitchen had set up a folding table and a plastic barrel of coffee. A line of weary souls had already formed, some standing, others slouched on walkers or crutches. Shaquille took his place in line without a word. No one noticed him. No one cared who he was. The volunteer behind the table was a teenage girl with pale skin and a ponytail that bounced every time she ladled oatmeal into a paper bowl. She handed Shaquille a slice of dry bread and a small cup of lukewarm coffee. He nodded silently, moved to a low stone wall, and sat to eat. Walter joined him with a similar meal, tearing his bread into pieces and chewing with slow, deliberate effort. "This here," he said, lifting his cup slightly, "this is what folks think feeding the poor looks like. What they don't see is what happens after." Shaquille nodded slowly, watching people shuffle by, heads down, hands wrapped around their cups like lifelines. Every face told a story, grime embedded in wrinkles, clothes layered like armor, eyes either hollow or defiant. Walter gestured subtly to two uniformed officers standing near the entrance of the park. They stood with their hands on their hips, scanning the line with hard eyes. "They like to show up when the food comes, like shepherds keeping wolves in line. Do they help?" Shaquille asked quietly. Walter snorted. "Help? Nah, they watch. Sometimes they harass. Make sure none of us forget we don't belong." Shaquille said nothing. He sipped his coffee and felt the bitterness settle on his tongue. A few moments later, his gaze fell on a young man nearby, barely in his 20s, crouched near a bench beside an elderly woman. His clothes were shredded, his shoes mismatched, but there was a flicker of gentleness in his face as he whispered something to the woman. Shaquille reached into his pocket, pulled out the piece of bread he hadn't eaten, and walked toward them. "Here," he said quietly, offering it to the young man. The young man looked at him surprised. "You sure?" "Yeah." Shaquille nodded. "It's yours." The man took it with both hands, bowing his head. "Thank you." Not many would share. Shaquille turned to walk back, but was stopped mid-step by a sharp voice behind him. "Hey!" the voice barked. He turned slowly. One of the officers was striding toward him, his face already hard, his hand resting on the baton at his belt. "What's going on here?" the officer demanded. Shaquille lifted his hands slightly, palms out. "Just sharing some food." The officer sneered. "Sharing food? Looks more like a drug deal to me." Shaquille blinked. "That's not what this is." "Don't talk back." The officer's tone sharpened. "Stand up. Let me see your hands." Walter stepped forward. "He didn't do anything. Leave him alone." "Back off, old man," the second officer snapped, shoving Walter in the chest. The soup line had frozen. People stood in place, their paper bowls in hand, watching. Phones started to appear, lifted slowly, cameras rolling. Shaquille rose slowly. "I'm not resisting," he said calmly, but the officer didn't care. He pulled out the handcuffs and moved in. "We'll see about that." Without warning, he yanked Shaquille's arm back and slammed him against the nearby tree. The bark tore into his cheek. The cuffs clicked shut, tight, too tight. Pain shot through his shoulder. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "He didn't do anything," someone shouted. The officers ignored it. They dragged Shaquille across the park as if he were a bag of trash. People recorded, others watched in stunned silence. The young man with the bread stared, frozen, the slice still clutched in his hand. Inside the patrol car, Shaquille was thrown into the back seat. The door slammed shut. The engine started. The officers didn't speak to him. They spoke to each other, laughing, joking. "Another cleanup," the driver said. "Bet he's got a record as long as my arm." the other replied. Shaquille stared out the window, heart pounding, hands burning. His mind spun. The humiliation stung, but it was the deeper realization that shook him, the understanding that this was routine, casual, expected, and no one cared. At the station, the booking was swift and impersonal. No questions, no charges explained, no explanation. Just forms, fingerprints, and a cell. The metal bench was cold. The air smelled like bleach and sweat. Shaquille sat still, hands red and raw, eyes staring ahead. He had wanted to understand what they went through. Now he did. But this was only the beginning. He leaned back against the wall and whispered to himself, "Now they've seen what they do to giants." And he waited for what would come next. The walls of the holding cell were bare, gray, and soaked in a sterile stench of bleach and old sweat. The air inside was dry, humming with the faint electric buzz of overhead lights. Shaquille sat alone on the cold metal bench, his hands still cuffed behind his back, red marks cutting into his wrists. He stared straight ahead, expression tight, every part of his body sore from the rough treatment he had endured. He was still Barry here, still invisible, still anonymous. No towering banners, no endorsements, no roaring crowds. Just another black man in a police cell. Minutes turned into hours. The fluorescent lights didn't flicker or change. They just stayed there, white, cold, and indifferent. The silence was only broken when the door creaked open. 2 officers entered. One was tall and stern, with a buzz cut and a clipboard in his hand. The other, much younger, trailed behind, eyes darting nervously. "Get up," the older one barked. Shaquille rose slowly. The muscles in his back groaned from the night on concrete, and his shoulders were still stiff from how tightly they had pinned his arms. His expression remained unreadable. The officer motioned him through the door and down a narrow hallway. The buzzing lights continued above them, casting shadows that twitched as they walked. Shaquille glanced sideways at the younger officer. The young man avoided eye contact. He looked like a kid barely out of the academy. They entered a windowless interrogation room. In the center stood a metal table and 2 mismatched chairs. A small camera blinked red in the corner of the ceiling. The older officer pointed to a chair. "Sit." Shaquille obeyed. The officer sat across from him and placed a clipboard on the table. "So," the officer began without looking up, "you want to tell me what you were doing in the park this morning?" "I was sharing a piece of bread," Shaquille said evenly. The officer looked up sharply, his face hardening. "That what they call it now?" Shaquille didn't respond. The officer leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You think you're clever? You think coming in here with no ID and some fake name is going to fly? I didn't do anything wrong." The officer chuckled dryly. "Sure, you're just another victim, right?" He leaned forward suddenly. "Let me guess. The system is against you. You were just minding your own business. Typical." Shaquille kept his eyes steady. "I've already told you the truth. You don't have ID, you've got a homeless look and no record on file, but your prints are in now. We'll see what pops up." He smirked. "Maybe something you forgot about." The younger officer shifted in the corner, his eyes narrowing at the comment. The older one stood abruptly and slammed the clipboard onto the table. "Here's the deal," he growled. "You either tell me who you really are and what you were really doing, or you'll be spending the night in Gen Pop. And trust me, they won't treat you any better than I have." "I've already told you," Shaquille said, "everything you want to know." The older cop snorted. "Fine, be that way." He turned to the younger officer. "Watch him. I'll be back when the prints come through." The door slammed behind him, leaving Shaquille and the young man alone. For several minutes, the room was silent except for the low hum of the light. Then the young officer spoke. "You don't talk like most guys we bring in." Shaquille looked up. The officer hesitated. "The way you speak, it's calm. Educated?" Shaquille gave a tired smile. "What does that mean?" "I just mean—" The young officer looked embarrassed. "Most people who end up in here don't sound like you. You're different." Shaquille didn't answer. He just watched him. "You don't belong here," the officer muttered. "I mean, I don't know what happened out there, but that other cop, he didn't have to cuff you like that." "Why didn't you stop him?" The young officer looked away. Before the conversation could go further, the door opened again. This time, a third man stepped in, a sergeant with a silver badge and sharp eyes. The sergeant looked between the two men, then held up a folder. "We need to talk," he said to the older officer who had just stepped in behind him. They both stepped out, but the door remained slightly ajar. Shaquille leaned slightly, trying to catch their conversation. "Prints are clean," the sergeant whispered. "No record, but there's a match. It doesn't make sense." "What kind of match?" the older officer asked. There was silence. Then the sergeant muttered, "Shaquille O'Neal." "What, like the Shaquille O'Neal?" "Apparently, yes. Facial structure matches with minor changes. Scars, height, everything lines up. This is him." Another silence followed. When the door opened again, the sergeant entered, followed by the two officers. The young one now looked like he had seen a ghost. "You're free to go," the sergeant said, his voice flat. "That's it?" Shaquille asked. "That's it," the sergeant replied. He wouldn't meet his eyes. Shaquille stood slowly. His wrists still ached. "You're not going to ask why I was there? What happened?" The older officer stepped forward, then stopped. His confidence had vanished. Shaquille stared at all three of them. "You didn't treat me like a man. You treated me like garbage." "Look," the sergeant said quickly, "this was all a misunderstanding. We thought—" "You didn't think," Shaquille interrupted. "You assumed. That's what you do." He turned and walked toward the door. The officers made no move to stop him. As he stepped outside into the gray daylight, a gust of wind bit through his coat. The city was still there, buzzing, roaring, uncaring. He stood on the steps of the station, breathing deeply, his mind racing. Everything he had feared was true. This wasn't about a badge or a policy. It was about perception, about how people like him were seen the moment they stopped being famous or powerful. He pulled out a phone from his coat. It had been off the entire time. He powered it on and saw dozens of missed calls, texts, alerts. His security team had tracked him. They knew where he was, but they had respected his request not to interfere unless it got dangerous. He walked down the street, every muscle in his body sore, his soul heavier than it had been in years. But there was clarity now. He had gone looking for truth, and he had found it. Now it was time for the world to know it too. By the time Shaquille reached his hotel, the afternoon sun was low in the sky, casting long golden shadows through the streets. His steps were slow, his joints ached, and the bruises on his wrists were starting to purple beneath the skin. But there was no time for rest. He didn't speak to the hotel staff. He didn't remove his disguise. He went straight to the room, locked the door behind him, and stood before the mirror. He stared at the reflection that had walked the streets unnoticed. The worn clothes, the grime, the broken look. He could still hear Walter's voice. Black, broke, and in the way. That phrase kept echoing. Shaquille reached for his bag, pulled out his phone again, and made a call. The line picked up on the first ring. "Shock?" a voice asked. It was Marcus, the head of his private security. "It's time," Shaquille said, his voice hard. "We go public. I want every second of that arrest to be out there." "Are you sure?" "Yes. Get the footage from the people in the park. Someone had to be filming." He paused. "I want a press conference scheduled within 48 hours. Major networks. No pre-approved questions." Marcus didn't hesitate. "Understood." Shaquille hung up and sat on the edge of the bed. He removed the cuffs from his backpack, still locked at the tightest notch, and stared at them. The metal glinted under the hotel light. He set them on the nightstand like evidence. The next morning, the news began to move. A video had surfaced on social media, grainy but powerful. It showed a large man in rags being slammed to the ground by two officers in the middle of a city park. The man didn't resist, he didn't fight. Yet the officers shouted, shoved, and cuffed him with brutal force. Within 2 hours, someone online identified the man in the video as Shaquille O'Neal. The internet exploded. Within 4 hours, every major outlet had picked up the story. By nightfall, hashtags were trending. #Shaq was one, obvious. #Justice in disguise. #He walked our streets. The press conference was set for the next day. The venue, a downtown civic hall, already surrounded by flashing cameras and murmuring reporters. The line of attendees wrapped around the block. Protesters gathered too, some with signs of support, others with signs attacking the police. When Shaquille stepped onto the stage, there was silence. No bodyguards, no makeup, just Shaquille O'Neal, in a simple dark sweater, looking every bit as bruised and worn as he felt. He adjusted the mic, cleared his throat, and began. "I didn't come here as an athlete," he said, "not as a celebrity. I came here as a man, as a black man in America." He let that sit in the air. "I walked the streets, I wore the rags, I slept under the freeway, I shared food with people who had nothing to give. I saw how the police treated them. I felt what it was like to be invisible, until you become a target." He described the arrest, the false accusation, the way the officers spoke to him, the slam to the ground, the cuffs. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point fingers, but his words cut through the silence like thunder. "I didn't get arrested because I broke the law. I got arrested because I fit a story they've told themselves over and over again. A story that says if you're black and poor, you're dangerous. If you're dirty, you must be guilty. If you're quiet, you must be hiding something." He looked out at the sea of journalists. "And if this happened to me, imagine what happens to the millions of people whose names you don't know. The ones without a platform, the ones who don't walk out of that cell the next morning." The crowd was quiet, but the energy in the room was electric. "I'm not asking for sympathy," he continued. "I'm demanding accountability. We don't need more statements. We need action, policies, oversight, training, change." He stepped back. "And I won't stop. Not now." The room erupted in applause. Camera flashes filled the air, but Shaquille didn't linger. As soon as he exited the stage, his team was already mobilizing. Interviews, editorials, meetings with city leaders. He agreed to meet with civil rights organizations, homeless advocacy groups, and education reformers. He made calls to senators and mayors. He shared space with grassroots activists, not to take over, but to amplify. He returned to the park where it had all begun, and Walter was there, leaning against a pole, watching the crowd that now gathered not to sleep, but to listen. "You really did it," Walter said, shaking his head in disbelief. "They actually listened." Shaquille offered a tired smile. "Some of them. The rest will." They walked together through the temporary clinic that had been set up with Shaquille's help. A mobile food unit served hot meals. A stage had been erected for community speakers. Medical tents offered basic care. Volunteers passed out blankets and hygiene kits. "This is a start," Shaquille said, "but it's not the end." Walter nodded. "It's more than anyone else ever did." That night, as helicopters flew overhead and the chants of peaceful protesters echoed through downtown, Shaquille sat at a folding table, signing paperwork to fund 3 new shelters across the city. A journalist approached him, notebook in hand. "Mr. O'Neill, what would you say to those who think this is just a publicity stunt?" Shaquille looked up, his eyes heavy with truth. "I'd tell them to spend one night under a bridge," he said, "and see if they still feel the same." As the reporter walked away, Shaquille turned to Walter, who now sat beside him with a plate of donated food. "They'll try to spin it, dismiss it, move on," he said. "But we won't," Walter replied. "We'll keep showing up." Shaquille nodded. He knew the real work was just beginning. The courtroom was packed. Journalists lined every bench, their pens poised, cameras set, microphones waiting. The hum of whispered conversations filled the space, broken only by the occasional clearing of a throat or shuffle of papers. Shaquille sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, dressed in a dark navy suit, his back straight, his hands folded calmly in front of him. His face was calm, but his jaw was set, his expression unreadable. This wasn't the arena he was used to, but it was a battleground all the same. Across the aisle, the defense attorneys shifted in their seats, representatives from the police department, the city's legal team, and union observers. All of them avoided meeting his eyes. The judge entered. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Everyone stood. The judge, a composed black woman with sharp eyes, settled into her chair. "Be seated," she said firmly. After a brief pause, she began. "This court has reviewed the evidence and heard the testimony of all parties involved in the unlawful arrest and physical mistreatment of the plaintiff. The incident captured on video was not isolated. The evidence has revealed patterns of misconduct, abuse of authority, and discriminatory profiling rooted in systemic bias." Murmurs swept through the room. Shaquille didn't blink. The judge continued. "Therefore, this court finds the defendants, the involved officers, and the city's police department guilty of excessive force, violation of civil rights, and racial discrimination." There was a collective exhale from Shaquille's team. "The department is ordered to pay damages," she said, "and implement sweeping reforms, including mandatory anti-bias training, independent civilian oversight committees, and revised arrest protocols. Furthermore, the officers involved are to be suspended immediately, pending internal disciplinary review." Reporters scribbled frantically. Cameras clicked like rapid gunfire. Shaquille didn't smile. He only bowed his head slightly, as though accepting not a victory but a burden he had willingly chosen to carry. Outside the courthouse, the city had changed. Protesters marched peacefully with banners and signs bearing his face, Walter's name, and messages like "Dignity for the Voiceless," "You see us now," and "This ends today." In the weeks that followed, more cities joined the call. Governors were forced to respond. Police unions pushed back, filing injunctions and denouncing the court's decision. Conservative media branded Shaquille a radical, a provocateur, a liar, but the footage was undeniable. His testimony had been raw, factual, and unflinching, and the public stood behind him. Still, threats came, anonymous letters, chants from counter-protesters, graffiti sprayed outside his foundation's headquarters. His security detail tripled. Letitia, his wife, begged him to step back, but he refused. "This isn't about me," he told her quietly one night, and it never was. Instead, he poured everything into the movement. He returned to the shelter site beneath the overpass where it all began. But it wasn't the same anymore. The tents were gone. In their place stood a newly built center with bright lights, clean walls, and rows of beds. A small clinic operated out of the back. A library for children was being stocked. Showers, lockers, classrooms. It had become something living. Walter stood near the entrance, talking with a young man filling out an intake form. "You did it," Walter said when he saw Shaquille. "This place is real now." "We did it," Shaquille replied. He walked through the halls, watching volunteers hand out meals and kids chasing one another with toy cars across a tiled floor. A mural painted on one wall showed people of every background, standing tall together with the words, "We are seen," in bold above them. More shelters followed in Atlanta, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Newark. Programs for job training, mental health clinics, legal assistance for the homeless, educational scholarships for displaced youth. Everywhere Shaquille had walked as Barry, he now returned as himself, to listen, to invest, to build. Still, the resistance didn't disappear. The police union filed lawsuits against the oversight committees. Pundits called his work a circus. Anonymous threats arrived weekly. Some cities refused to implement changes, and some officers openly mocked the movement. One evening, Shaquille received a handwritten letter in the mail. It was from the young officer who had stood silently in the interrogation room, who had avoided his eyes. "I should have said something," the letter read. "But I didn't. I let it happen. I let fear win. I've started speaking out. I've requested transfer. I'm trying to be better." Shaquille folded the letter and placed it in a drawer filled with similar notes. Some from officers, others from teenagers, veterans, teachers, mothers, fathers. Each of them had seen themselves in his story. Each of them had felt the shift. Months passed, a year. The movement didn't fade, it evolved. Shaquille launched a foundation called The Ground Level, with Walter as its community director. They focused on grassroots change, funding community organizers, launching local councils, offering direct grants to families on the edge. At a fundraiser, a journalist asked him, "Do you really believe this will change America?" Shaquille looked at her. "No," he said. "I believe the people will." At another event, a child asked him if he missed playing basketball. He smiled. "Not a bit," he said. "I was built for this too." The final scene came quietly. He stood once again under the overpass, now a paved walkway with flower beds and park benches. Families sat on picnic blankets. Laughter filled the air. A teenage boy read a book to a younger girl beside a fountain. The city skyline rose behind them, tall and distant. Walter joined him on the bench. "Never thought I'd see it," the older man said, resting his hands on a cane. Shaquille didn't answer right away. He just watched the light ripple across the fountain's surface. "They'll forget," Walter said after a moment. "Eventually, give it a few years. People move on." Shaquille shook his head. "Not this time." "How can you be sure?" He turned to him. "Because we're still here, and we're not going anywhere." Walter nodded slowly. "So what now?" Shaquille looked toward the street. "Now," he said, "we go to the next city." What Shaquille did wasn't just brave, it was necessary. He walked where few dared to walk and showed the world a truth it couldn't ignore. But this story isn't over. The fight for justice, dignity, and change continues. If this moved you, subscribe, like, and share this video. And let us know in the comments, do you think change is truly possible?